Everybody, this is Dream, and today for the late slate that starts at 8 p.m. EST for college basketball, we have a 7-game slate. All these games look pretty interesting. We have one game that's going to be likely a blowout, which is Houston over ECU. We have a couple games that are 5 to 10 points in the Duke game and the Oregon game, and then all the other games are under 5 points or less. And all of them are pretty even in the scoring, with the exception of the Oregon game being over only 129 points, and then the San Diego State-New Mexico game being over 145. So all the other ones are 135 to 140, and every team here has some viability. I will do a breakdown of each individual team at the end of the video, so we'll wait for that. So I've broken this up a little bit differently than I have before. So I've got my top 6 plays, which are the more expensive players. Then I have a group of mid-range players I think are decent today. And then I have my value plays. So I'll just go through these and give you those as we go. So we're going to start with these expensive plays. We're going to start with Drew Peterson here for the USC. He has big-time upside here. He's been great versus Utah in the past with 2 straight 30 fantasy point games against them. Never under 25 in 5 games versus them either. And he has played them for a few years. He has more upside here than just about any other player on the slate, and he's pretty well priced at $8,900. Obviously, he's pretty expensive, but he is viable here. A great option on the slate in general. Then we're going to look at Jalen House for New Mexico. He is a top player on this team. They're also one of the high-scoring teams on the slate. And he's going to have to play well in order for them to win the game, because this game is going to be close. But I think that he's in a really good spot. He's playing really well lately. He has just as much upside as anybody on the slate, and he has dropped 29 fantasy points on them the last time he played. 29 real points, good for 45 fantasy points the last time they played each other against San Diego State. And this is going to be a fast-paced game. I think he's a great option on the slate. One of my top players in general. Then we're going to look at Boogie Ellis, the other guard from Southern California. I wouldn't argue with putting him and Peterson together on the slate. However, it's going to be a little bit difficult to do that with all the other players. But he has some really massive numbers, and he's been dominating Utah in 3 games in his career, all over 29 fantasy points. He's a little bit more scoring dependent than Peterson is, and so I do prefer Peterson slightly. But he, along with Peterson, are both really solid options. I mean, between those 2 guys in house, we have a lot of good opportunity here on the slate. As for the forwards that I like the best, we're going to start with Justin Mutz. Justin Mutz is a little bit pricey, and he's got a tough matchup versus Duke. But he's been getting lots of good starts lately, and he's got good upside. I wish he was a little bit cheaper, but I think he can keep Virginia Tech in the game. And his floor isn't perfect, but it's not terrible like some of them. He has big-time upside as well, and he's been playing really well, and so I like his matchups potential here. Even though he had a tough game against Duke last time, he's got double-double potential here. Then we're going to look at Morris Udeze for New Mexico. Now, he's a little bit cheaper, and I like him a little bit more as a result of his price, simply because he's playing really well, and he's been getting double-doubles all season long. He has big-time upside here. He's probably got as much upside as anybody on the slate, and he's a little bit cheaper than some of the other options. New Mexico is also in the fastest-paced game on the slate, so he's worth a really good look. He's going to be really useful to pull some guys from New Mexico for your lineup today. It's going to be really, I think the top lineups are going to have some New Mexico players, and he's definitely the second or third best one available on the slate in general. So he's definitely in play. And then we're going to look at Jawan Roberts at $7,600. He's in an interesting spot here. He's got double-double potential. The risk here is the game gets blown out. But he's played under 30 minutes a lot this season. Sometimes fouls are an issue. But he has a lot of upside. And so he definitely looks like a good option on a slate. Though Houston is projected to win this game by a lot. He's one of the better options on the slate at a decent price as well. So I think he's a really good option. We obviously have some other guys that we're going to look at here. And these are going to be our, mid-range, $5,000 to $7,000 range players. And we're going to start with Jermaine Colsnard for Oregon. Since he's become the starter, he's been reasonably good. He's gotten a lot better. No games under 18 fantasy points the last 5 games, and then he's only had a few bad games before that. And he's also got nice upside, which is higher than a lot of other players in this price range. Being in a low-scoring game on the slate isn't ideal, but his price helps and makes him feel useful on the slate. I think it's a very interesting option. Definitely somebody to consider today. Hunter Couture for Virginia Tech. He starts and plays a lot of minutes, has a decent floor here. Does have a tough matchup with Duke, but he's played well in the past, and I think he has 5x potential in this matchup because of his price. He's also got a little bit more upside than some of the other options that are even more expensive than him. So I think he makes him viable. Russell Felton for East Carolina. Obviously in a tough matchup and one of the lowest scoring teams on the slate, and they may get blown out. But if anybody in this team is going to compete and score points, it's going to be Felton. He actually has really good upside. The concern here is that they get blown out, but he's still viable here, and he doesn't need a ton of points to make it worth utilizing him on the slate. Then we're going to look at our forwards, and Alex Dukas for St. Mary's. Now, he can actually play guard or forward. He's got a decent upside here. His floor has not been as good as I would like, throughout the year, but he has a tough matchup here. But he's been over 18 fantasy points in 4 of the last 4 games versus Gonzaga, and in the last 4 games against Gonzaga, he's also played at least 30 minutes. So I do expect him to play minutes. I think the forwards in this price range are not nearly as good as the guards, so do keep that in mind. If I had to choose between those top 4 I just mentioned, I would rank them in the order that I've talked about them so far. And then lastly, we're going to look at Miles Burns. Miles Burns has the same price as Dukas, and he has the same amount of upside, but he isn't super ideal here because the potential is not quite as good as Dukas, and he's just, he's on a team that's not projected to do particularly great today, but he's still interesting and still has played decently well, and so he is worth a look here. He's just been a little bit more streaky than some of the other options in this price range. But he is viable, and I would probably use him or Dukas potentially, but not both, in a forward position. Paying up and then paying for a value play might be the way to go here at the forward position. So then we're going to look at our value plays, our sub $5,000 plays, who I think are the best today. We're going to start with Emmanuel Sharp, and I got these in no particular order. But Sharp has tended to get more minutes when Houston blows people out, and they are primed to do that in this one. Look for him to get over 15 or so minutes and have some pretty good opportunity here to have a good DFS day. I mean, his potential isn't super high, but he is viable at this price simply because he's going to get a decent amount of minutes in this game, most likely. Then we're going to look at Javonte Johnson for New Mexico. He starts and plays good minutes. While his floor isn't ideal, his ceiling is solid, and he has a nice upside in a high points matchup, especially considering the fact that this game is probably going to be pretty tight, and he does play a lot of minutes, and so it doesn't take a whole lot for him to get the value that he needs. The only real risk with him is that he's very scoring dependent. Then we're going to look at Quincy Guerrero. Sorry if I'm butchering your name, for Oregon. He doesn't start, but he does play around 20 or so minutes a game, and he's been playing decent enough to give him a look, but he's somewhat riskier due to his price range, since he's no longer starting. So do keep that in mind. But if he could manage to draw the start, then he would definitely gain some upside. He's still a little bit risky as a result of the situation there. Then we're going to look at Micah Parrish for San Diego State. And I wish he was a little bit cheaper, but he's been playing about 20 or so minutes a game, and he's a decent play for the most part, especially in conference play. Only one sub 10 fantasy point game since the start of 2023. He should be able to contribute in this game and be a valuable asset in a game that should be relatively high scoring. Then finally, last but not least, is Reese Dixon Waters. In 2 games since returning from injury, he's been over 20 fantasy points. Both those games have been a good role, and he has rarely had bad games all year long. He looks like he's going to have a good mid 20-minute game going forward. and so I expect him to play well in this one and have some decent upside, though he's a little bit riskier than some of the other ones I've already mentioned. I don't really love the value plays today, but they are decent. And there wasn't really anybody that I could find under 4,000 that just jumped off the page that made me look super excited. But there's good options across the board here, and so I do think that it's a viable slate. It's just a little bit risky with some of the cheaper guys. And in order to pay up for some of our top tier plays, not being a whole lot at forward, unfortunately, so I would probably suggest going more in the forward range than for your pricier plays. But I think there's viable options all over the place. So with that said, guys, let's get into my breakdown of each individual team. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the Virginia Tech and Duke game. And so when we're looking at this game, Duke is favored to win this by 7. I actually think this game might be a little bit closer because Virginia Tech's played decently well, and they got some guys that are playing well, and they're going to score some points. As for Duke, not much really to like about this team. Everyone feels overpriced. There's a lot of guys here that are very streaky, and the minutes, aside from the top 3, are very sporadic. And those guys aren't even playing all that well. They're very inconsistent. And while this game does have a pretty good total points and a decent spread, I just don't like anybody from a fantasy perspective from Duke, simply because they're very inconsistent as a team right now. And then for Virginia Tech, there is a lot to like from this team, despite the tougher matchup. Mutz and Basil both look interesting, as well as Couture. And then Padula looks like a minorly good option here. He's going to be a tough game against Duke, but overall there are some considerations. I don't think anybody on this team is a must-play, but they definitely have some upside in potential. And then we're going to look at the USC and Utah game here. And this game is interesting. It's like a very tight game. For USC, Peterson and Ellis are top-tier plays, and Trey Wright and Dixon Waters are risky but playable here. And with a tight game with good upside, these guys are worth a look. I do think USC is a team that, while they don't have as high of scoring as some of the other teams on the slate, they're pretty close, and they have a good matchup and a tight game, and I expect them to play well in this game. As for Utah, they do have a couple injuries, but Brandon Carlson and Mark Anthony are the only ones that look very decent plays today. Everyone else seems overpriced or underutilized, and I think it should be a fairly close game, so those guys should have some opportunity. Then we're going to look at Houston and ECU, and this is going to be the game that's most likely to have a blowout, with Houston having a minus 19 upside against ECU right now. Sasser does look pretty interesting. You could even give a look to Walker, Roberts, and even Sharp. Chaney also has some upside here in this matchup due to the blowout potential. Sharp and Chaney both have that benefit if this game does in fact blow out. That said, they should get some minutes in this one, and they are interesting, but they do carry some risk. Sasser, Roberts, and Walker all have some good upside, but they are also pretty expensive. Then we're going to look at ECU, and if they weren't a 19-point underdog, they'd actually have quite a few players that were rosterable on this slate, because their prices are relatively reduced. Felton being the best one, and then Azur and Debonde, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, they would all be rosterable at these prices, though they are a little bit more risky because this game is going to be a little bit lopsided, and I don't expect anybody outside of Felton to really be that playable on the slate, but they are definitely some guys you could take a look at. As for Mississippi and LSU, this is an interesting game since Mississippi just fired their coach, and so they're also favored to win the game against LSU, and LSU really hasn't been playing all that well. And this game's at home for Mississippi, so that's a little bit of an advantage. And if you think firing a head coach can make a team reach its potential, then I would give Mississippi a look here. But I don't know that I'd roster anyone outside of maybe Morrell or Brakefield, but everybody seems overpriced on the team. But maybe they can reach their potential a little bit better now that they have a different coaching situation. As for LSU, this team does have some cheap options that draw some interest in Hannibal and Hill, but the rest of the team seems overpriced and just not engaged. Only 2 guys play good minutes, and neither of them look like good plays here at all. So then we're going to move on to the San Diego State and New Mexico game. And this game does look interesting as the highest scoring game on the slate. It's also a 2-point spread, which is very nice. And so for San Diego State, you can make an argument for almost all the guys on this team that play a lot of minutes. There's 9 guys on this team that play at least 17 minutes per game. The problem here is that that doesn't lead to great fantasy output since there's so many. And figuring out which of those 9 guys to roster is mostly a guessing game in this one. New Mexico is a safer team in this game, and so are the other team, and so are guys from other teams. Bradley and Parrish are the 2 guys that I think are the most rosterable, and then a couple other guys have some upside, but I think those are the safest picks on this particular team. As for New Mexico, this is obviously a high-scoring game, and this brings some good plays to New Mexico in House, Udeze, and Johnson. Steer clear of Mashburn and Alec today, as they are overpriced. But the 2 others that get minutes, Jenkins and Dent, Jenkins formerly is more interesting than Dent is, and they both have some upside on the slate. I would definitely look at Jenkins the most of those 2. As for the Gonzaga game, this game has a 5-point spread in Gonzaga's favor, but these games are usually pretty close. And for Gonzaga, you can make a good argument for Timmy and Bolton, but the rest of the starters are overpriced, and they tend to be pretty short with their bench. So I expect the starters to play most of the game, which does give them some viability, but everybody seems a little bit overpriced. As for St. Mary's, you could throw 4 of their starters, Johnson, Saxon, Dukas, and Mahoney, in here and feel decent if they can keep the game close. But I think Johnson is the safest of the 4, and outside of the starting 5, almost no one else gets any minutes worth mentioning. And so I think that both these teams are going to play their starters for the majority of the game, and they're all going to have some viability on the slate, with St. Mary's players being a little bit better in the value department just because of the pricing. And so I do think they're a better option. And then last but not least, the Oregon State game. And this game is going to be a little bit more lopsided, with Oregon favored to win by 8 points. To talk about Oregon's team, they are projected to win the game, and it is a low-scoring game. It's the lowest-scoring game on the slate. Guerriere, Cosinard, and Dante all look interesting. Richardson is priced too high to really utilize him here, and he's been having a bad fantasy points per minute. Nobody else is very interesting on this team. As for Oregon State, they are the lowest-scoring team on the slate, not named ECU, and they have a very deep bench. I don't really see how you can roster anybody from this team and feel good about it with the way the situation is played out and the fact that they just don't play anybody a ton of minutes. So overall, I think it's an interesting slate. The value is a little bit tough, but there's plenty of options available, especially if you want to dig into some of these teams that have high-scoring outputs. So thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.